As you introduced me, this is the 175th anniversary, not just of the Mormon Battalion service, but of the entire Mexican-American War. And that's not a terribly politically popular topic, perhaps somewhat even of an embarrassment to the nation, if you think about it. The loss of their lands destabilized the Mexican Republic. And while the lands that were added to the United States eventually precipitated the Civil War. And if you're like me, up until a couple of decades ago, I really didn't know anything about this story, much less the story of the Mormon Battalion, which is the only U.S. military unit ever created and deployed with its personnel selected from almost all of a single religious denomination and even named for that religion. And as such, it's pretty much guaranteed never to happen again in United States history. It's a really odd duck kind of a story, but let's deal with it just a little bit and give you some information and background. So first, I want to thank the Midland County Genealogical Society, the Grace A. Dow Memorial Library, and especially MCTV for their technical expertise, which is going to make our presentation available for people in the future. Lieutenant Colonel Phillips St. George Cook was the second United States Army commander of the Mormon Battalion. And he wrote in his text, The Conquest of New Mexico and California, that he just really couldn't find a way to describe the experiences that he had with Mormon Battalion. Our research and our experiences helped us better understand and gain insights into the journals that were kept by the soldiers. And there's quite a few journals. So thank you for this opportunity to share a small part of our hike, which we took to better understand what we were actually reading in their journals. You just really cannot appreciate the physical, emotional, social, economic, and spiritual impact of what these people experienced. But let's see what some of the things that we did learn. People ask me frequently, well, how did this even get started? Well, in 2001, I was working with a bunch of young scouts, Boy Scouts, and they decided they wanted to try to do historic reenacting. And we participated at the Bay City River of Time event, which they hold each year. And so over the next few years, as we became more experienced and we learned about the Mexican War era, which is what we decided to portray because River of Time didn't have anything for Mexican War. And it turned out a couple of the boys actually had ancestors in the Mormon Battalion. So with that background, the Mormon Battalion was recruited by the U.S. Army and at the express directive of President James K. Polk. So how did that happen? Well, during his 1845 campaign, Polk had championed the plan to expand the United States from sea to shining sea. He wanted to make the nation transcontinental, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Those were a couple of his campaign promises. So this manifest destiny concept gained popularity, and Polk was elected. And he immediately moved to put his plans into effect. Well, this is Mexico prior to the 1846 and 1848 war. As you can see, Mexico was much larger than it is today. Well, they were concerned about their borders. You see, Americans were crossing the border illegally and invading the Mexican province of Texas and New Mexico and California. And Texas had declared itself a republic, but Mexico took umbrage when the United States Congress and the President Polk annexed Texas as a new state within the United States. Well, troops were sent from both sides. And of course, naturally, fighting soon ensued. Tens of thousands of U.S. volunteers were needed to supplement the small standing army of just 7,000 men. This became quite a matter of national pride. Plus, it was free cash. Now, people often confuse the Mormon Battalion with the Mormon migration. So let me clarify that for you. In 1846, the Mormons were evacuating their city of Nauvoo, Illinois, with the intention of traveling to some remote but as yet unidentified location somewhere in the Intermountain West, or possibly as far as California or Vancouver, British Columbia. Due to the difficult weather and the lack of resources, Brigham Young was leading the exodus across Iowa, but they only got as far as Council Bluffs before the weather and everything else just stopped them. They ran out of money as well. And so that's the summer of 1846. And that's where the Mormon Battalion gets enlisted. Now, other small groups of the LDS Church, the Latter-day Saint Church, were also headed to join those in Nauvoo. I just have to briefly mention the small group that came out of Mississippi and Alabama and followed the Oregon Trail to the west. They got as far as Fort Laramie or Fort Bernard at the time, when they found out that Brigham Young and the rest of the Latter-day Saints were not going to be coming further west. They just ran out of time and it was too late in the summer. As a consequence of that, the Pueblo, the Mississippi Saints, as they were known, were invited to move further south to a little settlement known as El Pueblo in today's Colorado. That sets up the future situation, which we'll talk about just briefly. That's not the main part of the story, but it does enter into it with some importance. Well, General Wool and other of the military leaders were directed to invade Old Mexico and force the Mexican surrender. But this gentleman, Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny, was stationed at Fort Leavenworth, which is now in Kansas, and he was chosen to lead the Army of the West, as it was designated. The prize was always going to be New Mexico and Upper California, not Lower Mexico. Kearny's assigned task was to capture and occupy nearly half of Mexico's territory. This using less than 2,000 men, almost all of whom were untrained and undisciplined volunteers from Missouri. Consequently, Colonel Kearny was sending strong letters of protest to Washington that he did not have enough infantry to help hold the territories, even if they were able to capture them. All the volunteer troops from Missouri wanted to be mounted and ride their horses. So the question is, do you know the way to Santa Fe? Yes, but it wasn't by walking there, at least not for the Missourians. Well, just as Kearny's letters were arriving in Washington, D.C., Jesse Little was a representative of Brigham Young, and he arrived in the capital and began efforts to find some kind of government work contracts to help the Saints' migration so that they could move further west in 1847. So over a period of about a week, Little and Polk, with advice from others on the president's cabinet and friends of Little, they were able to hammer out a deal that would help the Latter-day Saints and help the nation's war effort. Well, what was that? The deal would be, could the Mormons supply 500 men to march to California and help hold it during the war? If so, if they could pony up 500 men, the nation would enlist them for 1 year. It would pay them, $7 a month. That's good pay. Mm-hmm. It would outfit them. The Army would feed them. It would march them to California under leadership of U.S. Army officers, and then at the end of the year, discharge them with their guns and other supplies near where your people are headed. That would be, they would be close to where the rest of the Mormons would be. Well, when asked why Polk agreed to this, he said that he wanted the arrangement in order to conciliate the Mormons to us as a nation. He didn't want these religious refugees to leave the boundaries of the United States with a bad taste in their mouth. Polk wanted them to be on good terms rather than throwing in with either Mexico or England out in the far west. Now, this is the very simplified version, but you can read much more about it in Polk's diary, which is online, and I'll send you to a link for that a little bit later. So, how did the enlistment take place? And I want to shift over to a different software now, one that we developed to show our research. And this is available online for free at the Mormon Battalion website. So I'm going to get out of this for a minute, and I'm going to jump over to, if you go to mormonbattalion.com, you'll come to the Mormon Battalion Association website. These are descendants and others who are interested in the Mormon Battalion story. We have a little group of historians and genealogists who have been working diligently, and this is our new website, which we're still filling out, putting more information in. So have a tour of it if you want to. We have documents and articles, but if you go to the tab marked Trail and click on that, you have interactive maps. If you want to get a mobile version, you're going to click up here where it says interactive map. But for what I'm going to use tonight, I'm going to come down here on my desktop and click Follow the Trail tab. And what you will get is our software, which we have put together to show the routes of the Mormon Battalion. We initially started developing in Google Earth, but have moved to this, and I'm going to use this same software, but I'm going to turn off some of these stretches that are not of critical importance tonight. These side trails, I'm going to follow mostly the red trail, and I will mention the others a little bit later, but just very briefly. So I'm going to turn off those others now and just come to this. After President Polk decided to enlist 500 Mormons if he could, he sent the orders to Colonel Kearney at Fort Leavenworth. It took 12 days for those orders to get there. And I'm going to zoom in now on that area. So the orders arrived at Fort Leavenworth, and he dispatched one of his dragoon or cavalry officers by the name of Allen, James Allen, up to find the Mormons. Now, of course, they were going across Iowa from Nauvoo to the west, and they were spread out quite a bit across the Iowa Mormon Trail. When Allen intercepted the Saints, the trail that he followed was come on, baby, there we go. The trail he followed was along a boundary line between a couple of different of the Indian tribes. And also it was a brown route that went up to Fort Raccoon, or also known as Des Moines, Iowa. And he was familiar with this route because he had been the commander of Fort Des Moines. Well, Mount Pisgah was a very temporary way station for the Mormons as they were going across Iowa. So he knew that these people were up there, and that's the route he followed to find them. When Allen got to Mount Pisgah, he made the proposition. He carried with him the orders from Washington and from General Kearney and said, "I'm here to enlist 500 people." Now, the Mormons are in the process of leaving the United States. They're religious refugees, and when they heard the offer, they basically turned to Colonel Allen and said, no, we're not interested. But if you want to talk to us over further, you need to go talk to Brigham Young. And Brigham Young had just gotten to Council Bluffs area. So I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit more. Well, so Allen takes off and follows the Mormon Trail on over here to Council Bluffs, where he meets with Brigham Young. Brigham Young says, "Oh, well, this is in answer to the petition I've sent by Jesse Little to Washington. Washington's come through with an idea for us to earn some money. So yeah, we need to pony up to 500 men." So Brigham Young and a few other men hop on their wagons and they start heading back along the Iowa Mormon Trail, and they go as far as Mount Pisgah, and they're doing recruiting all along there. That takes them about 10 days out and back before they arrive back at Council Bluffs. While they were at Mount Pisgah, 75 men signed up to enlist. And as they traveled along, I'm sure quite a few others did too. I'm going to zoom into Council Bluffs. So Brigham Young arrives back at Council Bluffs the afternoon of July 12. and he calls for a all camp meeting. By this time, there's close to 5,000 of the Mormons who have come into the area immediately around what is today Council Bluffs. So they have a meeting at a little place they call the Bowery. And this is a depiction from the late 1800s by an artist. And he's taking the description of the area from the people who had actually been there. So this is pretty accurate representation of this Bowery, a bush Bowery, where they call the people together, and Brigham Young's making the pitch saying, we really need to do this. And of course, people were extremely hesitant to do so. So that's on Sunday, July 12. On the next day, Monday the 13th, they actually start enlisting the men. And over the course of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, Brigham Young manages to convince about 450 men to enlist in the Mormon Battalion, well, enlist in the Army. The unit does not yet have a name. Well, of course, there's no photographs at this point of what's going on. So the best I can do is this sketch. If I can get it up there. Okay, this is sketched by Thomas Kane, who was not a Mormon, but he was there. He met with Captain Allen and camped with him a couple nights. So we're standing on top of the hills to the east of Council Bluffs. Here's Captain Allen's wagon and tent on the left-hand side of this. And you see the Missouri River along this line in the far distance, and the Missouri and the Kansas hills in the great distance. And all the wagons traveling along the bottom of the creek bed down through here. And it doesn't show up particularly well, but this area that's almost in the direct center of the image is a little camp that was the headquarters of the Mormon church at that time. And it's really hard to see, but right here is a flagpole that's sticking up with a flag pointing to the right. And that is literally the flag under which the Mormon Battalion volunteers begin to sign up on the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. Well, on the morning of the 16th, oops, sorry, wrong click. On the morning of the 16th, they've got 4.5 companies. They have 450 men. They call them together in a square formation, and Captain Allen takes command of the unit, and he gives them the name, and this is the Army speaking. Captain Allen is not a member of the Mormon church. Captain Allen says, well, since you're all Mormons and since you're a battalion, we're going to call you the Mormon Battalion, and he signs all of his official orders, the Mormon Battalion. They form up in a square to hear his instructions to them, and then they march off down about 6 miles to an area where they outfit for a few days before continuing their march down to Fort Leavenworth. They arrive at Fort Leavenworth the 1st of August, and they spend about 2 weeks getting outfitted and getting their equipment, getting their guns, having a little bit of practice, but not much. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more here again. I'm sorry. Well, Captain Allen takes sick, as luck would have it. So he remains at Fort Leavenworth, but he directs the battalion mid-month, about the 13th, 15th, to start heading on off towards Santa Fe. They get a few days down the road, and they stop at a prominent hill that's out on the Arkansas River bottoms. And they camp there for a couple of days. And while they're there, they have this horrendous storm, as only you get on the Kansas plains. Let me tell you about those guys. They are just absolutely terrifying at times. And the Tornado Alley, and you've heard of all those things. And the men start talking in their journals about getting thumped with hail. And I came across this beautiful photograph of a young man in Iowa who had gotten thumped pretty bad by some hail just a few weeks before we began our hike. And so, yeah, it's a little bit dangerous out there at times. Well, they continue hiking on down the Santa Fe Trail till they get to Council Grove. And at Council Grove is kind of like a last stop, a last way station for everybody to set their wagon tires and do their final preparations, because everything after that is going to be out on the prairies with absolutely no supplies, no support. It's what you've got with you, and it's what you can carry. The location of the original crossing is still there, and you can actually walk across this. The stream is just a few inches deep, and the rock crossing is still there. Of course, wagons loved to be taken across on rock crossings rather than on sand or quicksand, because then your tires sink into the sand and it's kind of hard to get through. We know from their descriptions that they camped almost exactly where the Kaw Mission was built a few years later as an education facility for the local Kansa tribes. And they're just finishing right now a delightful renovation of the Kaw Mission while it's been closed for the COVID. And within just a few weeks, it should be open again. And we're kind of excited to go and see the new displays they have put in there. But the battalion is camped right at where the Kaw Mission is located today. While they're at Council Grove, unfortunately, they get word that Captain Allen has died back at Fort Leavenworth. And so there's a question about who's going to lead the battalion. One of the Army officers from Fort Leavenworth comes out with the physician for the battalion and says, if you want, I will lead you to Santa Fe and to General Kearney, and then he can decide what to do in terms of leadership. So with a little bit of discussion, they decide to do that. But it turns out that Lieutenant A.J. Smith of the U.S. Army, he's a full-time Army officer, graduated from West Point. He's been on the frontier for about 15, 18 years, I think it is. And he's been well-trained. He knows what's supposed to happen. And he's got all these basically farmers who are marching in their farm clothes. They don't get uniforms, but they've got guns. And he's leading them west, and they don't necessarily want to follow Army regulations all the time. Of course, they're probably ignorant of most of those Army regulations and how things are done in the military. So a few years ago, a gentleman who is now the Army historian for West Point, a gentleman by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Sherman Fleek, wrote a text called The Military History of the Mormon Battalion, where he examines this dichotomy where the Mormons don't understand and the Army, they're talking to each other, but neither of them are understanding each other. It gets humorous at times. Other times it gets a little tense. But, that's kind of the way it is with volunteers. If you take them out and put them in a military situation, they have to learn a lot. So Lieutenant Smith takes control. Actually, he's given control by the members of the battalion, and he begins to march them further west towards Santa Fe. So I'm going to follow along just a few locations that I think are kind of interesting. Now, I mentioned earlier, as they're headed west, the Mississippi Saints had gotten out in front of them. And as it turns out, 7 of those men decide to head back to Mississippi to get more families and bring them west the next year. Well, those men are coming down along the Arkansas River, and they're headed east while the Mormon Battalion is headed west. And somewhere here in this day, between this campsite and the next night's campsite, somewhere on the 12th of September, the two groups run into each other. Now, the Mormon Battalion, of course, is all men. However, Captain Allen had made arrangements so that some families could travel with the Mormon Battalion. So there's a group of camp followers. There's 20 laundresses that the Army permits to go along, but Allen had also arranged for about 6 or 8 families to travel along, and there's another 50 or 60 women and children who are following along each day with the Mormon Battalion. Well, this gets This gets a little bit uncomfortable for Lieutenant Smith, and he says, you know, where we're going, it's dangerous. We don't have the food for you, and it's not our responsibility to care for these families. So since there's this little settlement of your church members at El Pueblo, we're going to send you up to El Pueblo. So as they get down here to this area on September 15th and 16th, this location is known as the middle crossings of the Arkansas River. If you continued west along the Arkansas River, you would eventually arrive at Bent's Fort, and then further west, you'd arrive at El Pueblo. This branch of the Santa Fe Trail was known as the Cimarron, and General Kearney sent word back from Santa Fe, which had fallen to the American forces by this time. Kearney sent word back. He says, if you haven't already gone to Bent's Fort, take the Cimarron cutoff and come as quickly as you can, because this route was easier. It's across level prairie, and if you go the other route, you have some pretty nasty mountains to deal with. Now, I'm going to mention a couple sites that were of interest to us particularly as we were doing our research. One of the stories is that this first 50, 60 mile stretch as you leave the Arkansas River is pretty much dry. There's no springs there. There's no real water there. And this, of course, is late summer. So things have pretty well dried out. So there's this story by the men. They get to what they called a buffalo wallow that would hold a couple thousand buffalo. And I'm not going to get too descriptive, but I will read Henry Standard. I drank some water today that the buffaloes had wallowed in and could not be compared to anything else but buffalo urine, as a great portion of it was of the same. Yet we were glad to get this. Now their canteens would only hold about 3 pints of water. So if you've got 50 miles to go and you've only got 3 pints of water, that's going to give out pretty fast in the 80, 95 degree weather. And it did. So one of the things we were looking for was where this wallow was at. Well, the local historians, and I want to say something wonderful about local historians right now. Local historians know their area. And while you don't, if you can give them a good description of what you're looking for, they can probably help you find it. So we met with some of the local historians there, and this is the place they took us to. This is a very small spring. It only flows in the early part of the summer. And this buffalo, this depression, it's a natural depression out there in the prairie, which is as flat as a pancake. This thing stretches for the better part of a half mile north-south and pretty much about 1/8 of a mile east-west. That would certainly hold a couple thousand buffalo. It would hold water till late in the summer. And it's almost exactly the right distance that it should be if they were to reach it midday of that first day as they left the Arkansas River. So I think, and another aspect of this, we got more information about Santa Fe trails. This light blue line is one branch of the Santa Fe Trail from one of the middle crossings. The red line is the route the Mormon Battalion took. And that buffalo wallow, that big depression in the ground, lies right here on this county line, right between those two branches, which converge right upon that location. So I think we have a pretty good case to say that we know where that buffalo wallow actually was at. The scouts and the guides would have known about that fairly well. So this is a pretty rough area. It's all plains, very gently sloping, nothing dramatic. They get to the Cimarron crossing, and I've got to show you this one. This was another thing that we didn't realize we were going to find, but we did. There was a very small article written about a gentleman by the name of Lewis Dent, D-E-N-T, by Max Jameson, which I referenced down here in my sources. He found a map at Brigham Young University and had all these annotations on it. He finally backtracked that this map belonged to Lewis Dent and the Dent family. While we were out in the panhandle of Oklahoma, we were invited to come to this location, which is known as Inscription Rock and Autograph Rock. There are two different sections to it. And while we were at Autograph Rock, the property owner and I were talking, and he said, "What year did your people come through here?" I said, "Well, 1846. He said, "Oh, you're in the wrong place. You need to go up there to Inscription Rock." I said, "Well, okay, where's that?" So he sent me off over there. And when we got there and we were poking around, I really did not expect to find anybody's name that I would recognize. But right here, L. Dent, D-E-N-T, and right next to it, just less than a foot away, is J.C. Dent, D-E-N-T. Now, you just know that these two people are related somehow, because you're not going to find each other's names out there in the middle of nowhere. And it turns out that J.C. Dent is Jonathan Cromwell Dent, the brother of Lewis Dent. So Max Jameson, who had written the article and found the original map, he was all kind of excited because no one knew this was here. And so we've been able to share a little bit of information with the local historical society to let them know they actually have some famous people's inscriptions out there. Because actually the sister of the Dent brothers, Julia Dent, she married a young Army officer by the name of Ulysses Grant or something like that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so they continue their way. They make their way into Santa Fe, arriving there about the 10th of July, the 10th of October. Now, the battalion is, of course, quartered there. Lieutenant Smith is found out to be taking the battalion west, and General Kearney sends back Colonel Phillips St. George Cook to take command of the battalion. Now, Cook is also a West Point graduate, a little bit older than Smith was by about 6 years. And he is being mentored by Kearney. This is one of the best dragoons that they have in the military at the time. He's been on the frontier some 15, 25 years, I think, 24 years at this point, and extremely well respected. Cook becomes the commander for the Mormon Battalion throughout the rest of its march to California. He did not like volunteers. If I may say that gently, he did not like volunteers at all, had a very low opinion of them. And so when he takes command of the Mormon Battalion, they've got three strikes against them. First of all, he wanted to be with Kearney to go do battle in California. And now he's been assigned to carry this bunch of farmers who are volunteers to California. And oh, by the way, while you're on the way, why don't you build a wagon road as you do it? So now he's got all these reasons to absolutely be unhappy, if I may say it that way. Now, Cook was known for his colorful language, if I may say it that way. And the men even said later in life, they said, well, Colonel Cook, he could say things very strongly. They make their way south out of Santa Fe, and we know from their journals that they pass right by a place called Rancho de las Golondrinas. Now, if you ever get out to Santa Fe, you want to try to go to Rancho de las Golondrinas. It's kind of like the Williamsburg of the West. It is a hacienda that dates back to the mid-1700s. They have preserved it. They have marvelous events there during the year. The Harvest Festival is held in early October, and we like to go there. We were just there again this October to present and have descriptions and have interactions with the historians there. I cannot recommend that location highly enough. If you ever go Interstate 25 up from Albuquerque to Santa Fe or from Santa Fe south to Albuquerque, you'll pass this monument right alongside the highway. This is placed right on the original trails. If you were to get out, don't do that because it's right on the interstate. But if you were to get out, you can actually see the trail, which I'm going to zoom in here and let you see this. If you look closely, just to the side of the red line, you see these disturbances in the dirt right there. That is what's left of hundreds and thousands of wagons pass along through this area. Some areas preserve that very well. Other areas are too difficult and they don't preserve those tracks very well at all. So finding actual wagon tracks is kind of a neat thing. And some of us are called rut nuts because we like to go find wagon ruts. From Santa Fe, the Mormon Battalion makes its way south, and they haven't really started building wagon road yet. But as they get further and further south, the roads become less and less prevalent. In fact, right about this location, November 1st, November 3rd, they pass the location that is the last road. The road to Mexico actually takes off and goes to the east of this dark area along this yellow line. That's called the Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death, because that was really dry, whereas the battalion continued along the Rio Grande River. Here's another thing we found that we weren't expecting to, and this is kind of important because on November 3rd, one of our guys dies and is buried right along the Rio Grande River. They get one day further south and they pass by a peculiar rock, which is known as Emerys Rock because a month before them with General Kearney, Lieutenant Emery, one of the topographic engineers, sketched it and described it. And it turns out that Kearney even had an artist with him, and they painted this rock, and that's what it looked like in 1846 as they passed by. Well, this rock had been lost. No one knew exactly where it was. There was a claim that it was a certain location, but myself and another historian who studies Kearney's route had looked all over that square mile to find that stupid rock, and we could not find it. We started comparing notes in late 2018 because both of us were supposed to speak in Santa Fe at a conference. And I said, well, Tom, do you know where that's at? And Tom said, no, Kevin, I don't. I was hoping you knew where it was. So we started comparing notes, and in Google Earth, we were able to see the shadow of a rock that kind of looked like what the shadow of this would look like. So I took occasion, I drove down there, took a look at it, and that wasn't it. It didn't match this at all. I mean, there were some things that were similar, but it wasn't right. So I decided to go bushwhacking, went out actually into the river bottoms of the Colorado River. And this is what we found. Come on, baby. There we go. So this is my good friend, Ron Kirkpatrick. We're out there, and I think we now have located Emerys Rock. And here's another view of it from the east side. And you'll see that that matches Captain Johnston's sketch of it very well. However, these other rocks have been completely buried by flood silt along the Rio Grande River. So the river bottoms have raised probably 20 to 30 feet, which was one reason it was kind of hard to find. The other reason it was hard to find is because it was underwater. This whole area is part of the Elephant Butte Reservoir, and the reservoir had filled up and actually covered over Emerys Rock for close to a century. We lucked out and got to it in a dry year. We were just back there a few weeks ago, and the river has risen again and is lapping right at the very base of Emerys Rock. So we feel very fortunate we were able to find these places. Now, as is typical, whenever you're on an expedition into unknown areas, the Army immediately cuts your rations to half rations. And they rely on their hunters to go out and try to do some hunting to find food for them. Of course, now the buffalo, they pretty well passed through the buffalo area. And out here, you've got pretty much deer. You'll have some sheep that you took with you along. You'll have some beef that you took along with you. And if your mules and horses die, well, you can use those too. One of the locations we were able to find is this Latinaha, a water basin in the rocks. This area up above drains, probably about 100 square miles, and the water funnels through this little canyon and drops over a series of little basalt rock barriers, if you will, and forms this basin down below. And the men describe this. This also was lost for the better part of a century, having been forgotten where it was. It was found in late 80s by a husband and wife who flew around in their airplane looking for it and finally found it. I'm going to cut this a little bit just by saying, as they get further and further west, of course, it gets drier and drier. This is a place called Cow Spring. It's a ranch. The spring has been capped and has been drained for use on the ranch, but that's Cow Spring. And this was even sketched by one of the men by the name of Levi Hancock. At the bottom of this, it says spring, and he's drawn this with east at the top. North is off to the left, south is to the right. Here's the camp with all the tents. Here's the spring, and here's the mountain ranges in the back. Here's another little story. The scouts at this point don't know where to go. They can't find any more water to the west. So they put up a smoke signal, and the notations over here show that this is a smoke signal going up. And in rides some Mexican traders with their mules. And while one of the men is out trying to gather some sticks and he's carrying them on his back, up rides one of the Apaches from the tribe with this really long spear and pole with a very wicked looking point on it. And this guy, a number of the journalists say he sees the Indian coming with the spear and just absolutely freaks out, throws off all of the wood that he's collected and comes running into camp, which creates great hilarity among all of his friends because these are friendlies. They're not going to come in unless they're going to help you. So things start getting worse and worse as they go further. I mentioned the scouts. Let me share with you that one of the scouts was a young man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. He was, you may recall, the son of Sacagawea of the Lewis and Clark expedition. By this time, he is now middle-aged. He had gone to England. He had gone to Germany with Prince Wilhelm and spent close to a decade in Europe and Africa working for Wilhelm. Had 2 children, neither of whom survived. He came back, was a scout for the Army, and was assigned to help take the Mormon Battalion to the west. This stretch, as they drop down to the south, trying to find water, is known as Cook's Wagon Road. This is the area that they are literally building a wagon road as they go. And Cook, in his journals, just finds this amazing. He says, we're building a wagon road as we're exploring. And he just thinks it's insane. They get to the San Pedro River in what is today Arizona. They follow that north for a few days, and they have their only battle. They get into a battle with a bunch of wild bulls. And you know how stories become funny after things that don't go well sometimes become funny after a few years? Well, this is one of those. They are quite in danger as these bulls are charging them, and everybody's shooting in all these different directions. Someone could have been injured very easily or killed, but in fact, only a few minor injuries occur. But this is generally known as the Battle of the Bulls. As they proceed further north, they have to pass by or through the most northern frontier town of Mexico, which is known as Tucson. This is a very small presidio occupied by somewhere around 200 to 300 people. The Mormon battalion's coming. The military commander of Tucson says, "You can't come through here. It's Mexican territory." And Cook says, "Well, we sure can't go around. It's too far. There's no water. Can we trade? Can we come into town and trade?" And the Mexican leader says, "No." Commandant says, "No, you can't come here." And Cook says, "Well, we're coming anyway." So everybody fixes their bayonets. And let me tell you, 335 guys with their guns and their bayonets affixed has got to be a terribly imposing sight. In order to avoid a problem, the Mexican commander leaves and takes his troops further south, leaving just the locals to stay and trade with the Mormon battalion. It's all done in a friendly way. It was one of the closest the battalion ever got to a battle. They continue across this 90-mile desert. They get to the Gila River where the Pima tribes are at. These are a wonderful group. They were very kind to Americans and Mexicans. They tried to stay on good terms with just about everybody. And from there, the Mormon battalion then has good water as they follow the Gila River further southwest before they come to today's Yuma, Arizona, where they join the Colorado River. I want to back up just one thing and share this. Before I did my hike, I kind of thought to myself, I deluded myself into thinking, well, this is just going to be like 220 overnight campouts. It's not going to be that difficult. Well, one of the things that scared me, quite frankly, when I finally learned it, was this story. As they're coming along this stretch of the Gila River, they lose about 1,000 pounds of flour. They tried to float it down the river, but it got stuck and they lost another 1,000 pounds of flour. And this, of course, while they're still on reduced rations. So here's the story. When they find out they have lost the 1,000 pounds, Cook calls everybody to stop. And he says, "Bring all the food you have left in your company. We're going to put it right here. We're going to weigh it. We're going to figure out how much we've got left because we still have close to 3 weeks before we get to any food." So they bring the food in, they weigh the food. And when they're done, they find that everybody's going to get about 4 ounces of flour per day. Now, if you hold out one hand and you try to fill that with flour, that's going to be about 4 ounces of flour. It's not a lot. They're going to be able to have some meat, but not a lot of that. And that's really the entire rations they have been reduced to. Well, Sergeant Nathaniel Jones is one of the guys doing all this weighing, and he says, "We had a weighing frolic. I now weigh 128 pounds when I enlisted 198. If you do the math, he has lost 1/3 of his adult body weight. That's how bad this is. And he still has 3 weeks of some of the worst part of the trail to go. That's how bad it was. We tend to not think how rough it was for these men. All of this that's green today is irrigated land. This is the Imperial Valley of California. But if you can mentally erase all of that green and think, well, there's no irrigation, if you can instead mentally turn all of this green into this dust that is inches deep, that's what they still had to cross on almost no food. And it's only when they finally get across there to Vallecito and to Box Canyon that they finally get into water. They get to Warner's Ranch in California, and that's the first time they can get actual supplies, a little bit of meat, a little bit of food. And they still have about another week before they get to Mission San Diego. Now, because of the length of this story, I really can't do much more than that this evening. I will again refer you to our website with the Mormon Battalion Association. Go to the trail and follow the trail, and you can open up these place marks and look at them at your leisure. let me now just break a little bit and say, how does this, what has it got to do with Michigan? Well, we know at least one of the men came from Michigan, Thomas Dutcher. And after everything's over with, eventually he moves back to Michigan and he passes away over in Danby Township, Ionia County of Michigan. And he was married and lived there. This is Family Search. I assume those of you that work in genealogy are familiar with Family Search. Our second veteran of the Mormon Battalion is William Reynolds, also written Reynolds sometimes, probably just mispronounced. And he's over in the same area, Hubbardston, Ionia. They must have been pretty good friends, I guess, while they were in the battalion, although they were in different companies. Our third connection is, in fact, Lieutenant Colonel Phillips St. George Cook, who goes on to become loyal to the nation during the Civil War. He goes to Utah and is there for a number of years as a military commander. His last posting is in Detroit. And when he retires from the military in the 1870s, he remains there until he passes away in 1895 and is buried in Elmwood Cemetery, a lovely little place. Now, one final thing I'd like to share with you, since you're interested in genealogy. I don't know if any of you ever come across this, Relative Finder. It's a program put together by the Brigham Young University programming department, and it ties in with Family Search. You can get to it either just by searching Relative Finder online or going through ancestry.com. But kind of the fun thing is, if you've got some of your genealogy in Family Search, you can come here and you can see if you're related to anybody in the Salem witch trials, or somebody who was a famous music composer, or one of the Catholic saints or popes or the reformers. If you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, then there's going to naturally be some connections there. Well, you know, my mother joined the Mormon Church when she was a teenager, and so I don't really know of anybody I was related to in the Mormon Battalion until one day, just for fun, I came to Relative Finder and I clicked and said, well, yep, here we go. Am I related to anybody in the Mormon Battalion? Not expecting to find anybody. Well, my Mississippi relatives, in fact, my closest relative is my fourth great uncle, Thomas Charles Davis Howell. And I just about fell off my seat when I saw that, because I didn't know that I had anybody related to me in the Mormon Battalion. And it came through Caleb Howell, and that's sure enough, that's my relative. So just for fun, you never know who you're related to. So that's kind of most of my presentation. I just want to slip back to, I don't have time to show you all the pictures we took, or even some of the pictures, but my wife is telling me my time is up, so I'm going to hush here after I put up one more slide. Denny, if you want more details about her hike, my wife Denny is putting up podcast interviews. You know, we documented our side of the story, but we completely forgot all the people that we interacted with. So she's going back through recontacting a lot of these people and trying to get their thoughts, experiences, and insights, and putting those into a podcast for Battalion Trek. So feel free to join us in California, San Diego on January 27th. We're having a joint conference with the Oregon-California Trail Association to commemorate the 175th arrival of the Army of the West. We will have a great deal of events there, and it's a great one, great event, a great conference, and we invite you. If you need to get hold of me, I'm Kevin at battaliontrek.com. Thank you for your time and your patience. And stop share.
All right, so thank you, Mr. Henson. That was really fascinating. Walter, is there a meeting that you need to have after that? Do we need to have Kevin make you meeting host again for that?
No, there is no meeting following this.
Okay. All right.
I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. This is the most participants that we have ever had on here. Looks like a total of 35. That includes the speaker. So thanks all for coming. We will not have a meeting in December. We won't be meeting again till January. You can check out the mimgs.org website if you need to know what programs are scheduled. Thank you.